to Conversations with Therapists. Today I'm joined by Yitzy Adler of Adler Psychotherapy. Yitzy, thank you for being here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
One thing that stands out about your approach is that you don't see clients as broken. You often say people come to therapy because their coping strategies are no longer working. Can you unpack what you mean by that and how it changes the way that you work with clients?
Yeah, I think there's something very universal about what leads us into therapy. No one really sets out trying to create problems, and no one does things that are harmful for them deliberately. So depending on the issue, usually there's a good reason why we first start doing that. For example, you could take any type of addiction. I work with addictions a lot. So very often addiction begins when we're younger. There's usually an element of trauma there, or an element of neglect, or something where a person is challenged and they either don't have the capacity or the tools to respond to it in a healthy or adaptive manner. So they'll stumble upon something that makes them feel amazing or really helps them in a way. The tricky part about this is that very often in these circumstances was helpful in the beginning. When people are young, or they're just ignorant, or they're not as capable as maybe they are now when they're coming into therapy. But back then they were all alone, or they felt like they were all alone. And they didn't have people that they could turn to, or they didn't believe that they could turn to the people in their life. So very often they'll do the things, or they'll engage in behaviors or sometimes substances that will help them. And just getting back to that question, there is a part of it that's helpful. And usually what happens in an addiction is that it becomes less helpful. Time goes on. And very often when they're actually coming into therapy, it's actually become harmful to them. It's no longer become helpful or quasi-helpful. It's actually become harmful. But you kind of take that approach to looking at it from where it came from, and it was a very logical, reasonable thing to do. It's just no longer helping them. And that I find people respond well to that approach, and it resonates to them. And I think there's something universal about that also.
Going off of what you were just speaking about, how you treat a lot of clients with addiction and trauma and relationship issues, those things carry a tremendous amount of shame. How do you create a space where clients feel safe enough to be honest about the things that they've been hiding?
I think it's a couple of things. But one thing that I would highlight is that I have a lot of compassion for that, because I think people very often stumble into these maybe shameful behaviors, like we just discussed, from a place of not having a better option, or not knowing that there are better options, not knowing that there are people that you can talk to about these things, or not believing that there are people that you could talk to about these things, or not believing in your own worthiness. A whole bunch of things that I think is very understandable. The 2 points here is that one of them is that it's very, for me, I find that when I understand where people are coming from, and it makes it less bizarre and shameful and more reasonable. It just makes sense why you would do this. And I find that when I have that approach, and when I believe that about people, it lowers the shame. It gives them a perspective where they don't have to see things as, wow, why do I keep doing this? How could I be this type of person? How could I be doing this? And instead it's not that we're excusing behaviors or condoning them. It's just, it's understandable why someone would do that. So I think understanding is very helpful to lowering the shame. And the other thing that I find helpful is that there's something universal about shame. Like we all have things, I think, that we're shamed about, that we, even if it's maybe to greater or lesser extent, so probably always, not always, but there probably was a certain point in my life, or anyone's life, your life, that they felt not enough. And I think universality, that being in the same boat, really lower the shame. Like there's something very humanizing about that.
I think it's, like you said, it's important to have a space where people can understand themselves and understand what they've been doing to cope, whether it's completely conscious or some subconscious patterns too, is maybe not the most natural or normal thing to do as humans, but it's what's kept them safe in a lot of ways when maybe they didn't have the most safe environment growing up. And I think going back to what you said in the first question about how a lot of addiction issues start in childhood with trauma, potential trauma and neglect, I think really fascinating. I mean, we know, psychologically speaking, a lot of who we are is formed in childhood. But I think to reflect on who we are today and how we process or don't process and deal with certain emotions really can be linked back to the beginning of our life and how vulnerable, not aware we were at the time of how we were processing the world. You said we're not condoning ways of coping. We're just trying to understand ourselves better to lower the shame. And by lowering the shame, that's also how, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, by lowering the shame, that's how the real work can start.
What comes to mind hearing you speak is that, and it's an important point, I don't know if I underlined this before, but it's helpful to think of, you said that a large part of who we are psychologically is determined based on our childhood and upbringing. And that's true to a certain extent, but I like to think of it as our youth and childhood, it kind of puts us on a trajectory and it kind of shoots us out even through time, just going forward. And based on where you are launched and what direction and angle that you are, that will kind of determine flight path, so to speak, through time, through your life. But you can change, right? There is hope, right? There are things that we can do. There are treatment. And one point that I like to stress is that very often things which were maybe even arguably adaptive, right, were a good thing for you to do back then, they may no longer be adaptive, right? Because your capacity has grown, you're no longer the same person, you're more capable, you're more than you were before. And sometimes we don't realize that, right? Trauma, when there is trauma, is very often just disconnect between where I am now and where I was, and what I've learned from where I was based on the circumstances back then, it may no longer be true. And so the trauma treatment is helping clients update the template that they have that is no longer helpful for them.
Certified Sex Addiction Therapist, or CSAT, you work with individuals and couples navigating the impact of compulsive sexual behaviors, including online pornography use. If a wife begins to suspect her husband may be engaging in questionable online activities like pornography, but she isn't sure what she's seeing or how serious it is, what are some of the signs that she shouldn't ignore, and what would you want her to know before starting to jump to conclusions or confronting him?
It's a complicated question because I wish there was a formula that I could just kind of write out and impart, and every woman can kind of read it and be like, okay, I got this, I'm safe, I'm good. But it's a complex topic. And part of the complexity, just to refer back to this, is the amount of shame involved here. I think it's shameful for human beings in general. And as Orthodox Jews, we're not the only population that is particularly sensitive to this, but it is a sensitive topic. And that goes both for the husband, usually in this case, and for the wife. There's a whole bunch of associations and shame that's often associated with, for the husband, I'm watching pornography or things that I shouldn't be watching. And the wife also, my husband's watching this, and what does it mean for me? What does it say about me? What does it say about my body? What does it say about my marriage, et cetera, et cetera? A lot to unpack here. I think the first thing that I would want the wives of husbands that they suspect are engaging in these types of behaviors, I wanted to know that a couple of things. First of all, that she has a right to ask these questions. Very often, because it's such a shameful thing, no guarantee that if a woman suspects her husband is watching, there's no guarantee that she's right. So very often, if she might be wrong, so then she will kind of be very hesitant to ask this question. So I think it's important to know that she has a right to have this conversation. It's a fair conversation. I speak to Rabbanim, I speak to teachers, I speak to college teachers. It's a pretty rampant, I don't know the exact numbers, it's hard to say, but universally, everyone that I speak to says that this is an issue. That being said, I think the second thing that I would want women to know is that this is going to be a challenging discussion. This is going to be difficult. And that's true both for him and for her, right? Because, like we said, because of all the shame attached to it, because it's very charged, this topic. And knowing that it's going to be a difficult conversation, I think the third thing that I would want wives to know is that it's important that she has some way to regulate herself, go into the conversation as calmly as she can. I know that's a big and difficult thing to ask of her, because it's it's something that rightfully so panics and stresses out wives. And the normal reaction is one of panic, and either on the one hand, maybe trying to ignore it. Maybe there's a tendency or a desire to just, no, it's not my husband, or, and on the other hand, to kind of really go all out, so to speak, guns blazing if there's a suspicion. But neither of those things really are helpful here. It's difficult. It's a difficult thing. The other thing that I would want women to know, I think we're up to 4. Even if your husband is, on the chance that he is watching pornography, doing something that's compulsive in that area, that there is still hope. There's treatment available, both for him and for her, right? It's important that in these types of situations that both partners get treatment. And there are also a lot of organizations out there, both from the frum world and in secular world. There are 12-step groups, there are meetings, there are resources out there that can help her. And it's important to know that they can still build a beautiful marriage, a beautiful life together, even with him having done this. It's important to hold on to that hope without, I say this with sensitivity, without belittling or diminishing scariness of the subject and the impact, the trauma of it for wives. Because wives, it's important for men to know that wives finding this out about their husbands is a form of trauma, right? We call it betrayal trauma. It is. It really impacts women in this way.
I feel like we've only scratched the surface, or begun to scratch the surface of all the really important work that you do. But if someone watching this were considering therapy with you, but felt nervous, skeptical, or unsure about opening up, what would you want them to know about what the first few sessions with you are really like?
Well, I would want them to know that my style tends to be a little bit, certainly in the beginning, a little bit direct. I would want to know what they think the issue is and what they think the problem is. And I would also want them to hear from them rather, what they imagine or how they imagine therapy could help them. Because I find a very important thing to consider, right? Where I won't promise magical change or solutions, but they can expect someone who's direct, honest, and very pragmatic and practical. And I aim towards being non-judgmental, but I have a strong belief in being honest. And I would want the clients to know that they can ask me anything, and that any hesitations that they might have or anything that they're not sure of, they can ask me about it. It's important for me that clients understand the process of therapy. So I encourage clients to ask questions about therapy, that questions are encouraged.
Well, Yitzy, thank you so much for being here today. I know I learned a lot about you and your style and what you really believe in terms of how you treat clients and therapy that you provide. I'm just excited for whoever is watching this and feeling stuck and they don't know where to turn, specifically as it relates to addiction, trauma, relationship issues, to be able to reach out to you directly. Know that healing really is possible and that they're not alone. So thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.